You know what's dangerous about success when it comes too early? It has a way of convincing you that you've already arrived at the top when you're really just standing on the first step. It makes you think that talent alone is enough, that discipline is optional, that respect for those who came before you is somehow beneath your newfound glory. And when that arrogance takes root, when it grows so thick that you can't see past your own reflection, that's when the universe has a funny way of sending someone to remind you exactly how much you don't know. This is the story of Tyler Benson, a rising MMA star who had everything going for him until he made one critical mistake. He walked into a gym where legends gathered, opened his mouth, and disrespected a man who had earned more respect with his quiet presence than Tyler had with all his viral knockouts combined. What happened next wasn't just a lesson in humility. It was a masterclass in what real strength looks like when it doesn't need to announce itself. The gym was one of those old-school places where the equipment had been used by thousands of fighters, where the heavy bags bore the imprint of champions who had come through its doors long before social media made combat sports a spectator event for people who had never thrown a punch. The walls were lined with photographs, black and white memories of fighters whose names had been legends before most of today's athletes were even born. The air smelled like leather and sweat and decades of dedication. That particular scent that only exists in places where warriors have been forged through repetition and pain. Chucknorris stood near the back, watching a young fighter work the speed bag with impressive rhythm. At 73 years old, Chuck moved through the gym like he belonged there, because he did. Not in that entitled way where someone demands recognition, but in that quiet, earned way where recognition simply follows you wherever you go. He wore simple training clothes, nothing flashy, nothing with his name emblazoned across it. He didn't need the announcement. Everyone who knew anything about martial arts already knew who he was. He was here because teaching had become his meditation, because passing on what he'd learned over 6 decades of dedication gave him more satisfaction than any trophy ever had. Tyler Benson burst through the gym doors like he was walking into a nightclub, his entrance preceded by the bass from his headphones loud enough that everyone could hear it. 24 years old, 6'1", with a kind of physique that came from equal parts genetics and pharmaceutical enhancement, though he'd never admit to the latter. His record stood at 12 wins, 1 loss, and that single loss haunted him in ways he'd never acknowledge. So instead, he'd built a personality around being louder, brasher, more confrontational. His last 3 fights had all ended in first-round knockouts, and each one had gone viral, which his mind meant he'd transcended the sport into something bigger. He had 200,000 followers on social media, a podcast that got decent downloads, and a growing collection of people around him who made money by telling him exactly what he wanted to hear. His coach was more manager than teacher. His training partners were paid sparring partners who knew better than to make him look bad, and his inner circle consisted entirely of people who benefited from his success. It was a perfect ecosystem for breeding exactly the kind of person who would walk into a gym full of legends and see nothing but opportunities for content. Tyler's eyes scanned the space with the calculation of someone looking for an angle, a moment, something he could turn into engagement. His cameraman, a kid named Josh who followed him everywhere with a phone on a gimbal, was already filming. Everything was content now. Every moment was a potential viral clip. Tyler had built his brand on being the heel, the villain, the guy who said what everyone was thinking but was too polite to say. Except most people weren't thinking what Tyler said. Most people with any real understanding of martial arts, any genuine respect for craft, weren't looking at legends and seeing washed up as beans. But Tyler's algorithm had taught him that controversy got clicks, and clicks got sponsorships, and sponsorships got money, and money meant he was winning at something bigger than fighting. His gaze landed on Chuck, and something shifted in his expression. That look of recognition, not of respect, but of opportunity. He leaned toward Josh, making sure the camera caught his smirk. He strutted across the gym floor, his designer training shoes squeaking against the mat, his presence disrupting the focused energy that had existed moments before. Chuck noticed him approaching, but didn't change his expression, didn't adjust his posture. He simply waited, the way someone waits when they've seen this particular story play out enough times to know how it ends. Tyler stopped a few feet away, looking Chuck up and down with theatrical appraisal, his body language deliberately disrespectful, angle for the camera. When he spoke, his voice carried across the gym, intentionally loud enough to make sure everyone heard what was about to happen. He said, "Chucknorris, man, my dad used to watch your movies. You were huge back then, weren't you? Before MMA showed everyone what real fighting looks like." His words hung in the air like smoke, polluting the atmosphere. Several people stopped what they were doing, not because they wanted to watch, but because they couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. Tyler continued, playing to his invisible audience, the one that would watch this later on their phones. He said he'd heard Chuck used to be pretty good, that the old tournament karate had its place in history, but that was the key word, wasn't it? History, past tense, washed up, done. He actually used those words, washed up, his tone dripping with the kind of condescension that only comes from someone who's never been humbled by life, who's never had to rebuild themselves from nothing, who mistakes youth for permanence and talent for wisdom. Chuck's expression didn't change, which somehow made the moment worse for everyone watching, because his calm felt like the quiet before something terrible. He looked at Tyler with the kind of gaze that seems to see through you, past the bravado and the performance, straight into the hollow place where character should be. When Chuck spoke, his voice was measured quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you lean in because it carries more weight than shouting. He said that martial arts wasn't about proving yourself to strangers, that it wasn't about viral moments or building a brand. He said the true measure of a martial artist wasn't how many people they could beat, but in how they carried themselves when no one was watching, and whether they used their skills to build people up or tear them down. He said that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned through years of discipline, through showing up even when no one was recording, through understanding that the belt around your waist or the title on your name meant nothing if you didn't have character to back it up. Every word was a teaching moment that Tyler was too arrogant to receive. You could see it in his face, the way his smirk deepened, the way he glanced at his cameraman to make sure this was all being captured. He was already thinking about the thumbnail, the title, the engagement this would get. Tyler laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that was meant to diminish, to mock. He said that was beautiful, really very inspirational, the kind of thing you put on a motivational poster. But this wasn't the 80s anymore. Wasn't some feel-good movie where the wise old master could still compete. This was real fighting, modern combat sports, evolution. He said Chuck's generation had paved the way. Sure, and that was cute, but the game had moved on. The athletes were faster now, stronger, more technical. Training science had advanced. The old ways were just that, old. He actually challenged Chuck, right there in front of everyone. Said if Chuck thought he still had anything to teach, maybe he should step on the mat and show everyone what those old-school techniques look like against a real fighter. The gym had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, pressurized. Even Tyler's cameraman looked uncomfortable, like maybe this had crossed a line that even chasing content shouldn't cross. But Tyler was riding high on his own ego, on the adrenaline of performance, on the certainty that he was the future and Chuck was the past, and the only thing left was to prove it. What Tyler didn't know, what he couldn't know because no one had ever cared enough to teach him, was that Chucknorris held black belts in multiple disciplines, that he'd won countless championships back when tournaments were brutal and unforgiving, that he'd trained with and taught some of the most dangerous people on the planet, that his understanding of combat was built on a foundation so deep that Tyler's entire career wouldn't even scratch the surface of it. What Tyler didn't know was that age had taken some of Chuck's speed, sure, but had given him something far more dangerous in return. Timing, patience, the ability to read an opponent so completely that he knew what they were going to do before they did. The understanding that fighting wasn't about strength or speed, it was about control, about discipline, about making someone defeat themselves. Chuck looked at Tyler for a long moment, and you could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, not the calculation of whether he could handle this kid. That wasn't even a question, but whether this moment was worth it, whether responding to disrespect with action was the right teaching, or whether walking away would serve everyone better. But sometimes walking away sends a wrong message. Sometimes it teaches the bully that respect is optional, that legends can be mocked without consequence, that the young can disrespect the old without ever understanding what they're truly disrespecting. Chuck nodded slowly, that kind of nod that says, "All right, you want a lesson? Let me give you one you'll never forget." He said they could step on the mat, but not as a fight, as a teaching moment. No cameras, no recording, just two martial artists sharing technique. Tyler's face flickered with something. Maybe disappointment that he couldn't film it, but his ego wouldn't let him back down, especially not in front of everyone watching. He agreed, though he made a show of telling Josh to keep the camera ready for afterward when he'd explain what happened. They moved to the center mat, and the entire gym formed a circle around them, not with the energy of people wanting to see violence, but with a somber awareness that they were about to witness something that mattered, a collision between disrespect and discipline, between arrogance and earned wisdom. Tyler bounced on his toes, throwing shadow combinations, his movement sharp and impressive, the product of a decade of training under competent coaches who taught him technique, but apparently forgotten to teach him humility. He had speed, no question, his punches crisp and his footwork clean. But there was something performative about it, something that showed he was more concerned with how he looked than with what actually worked. Chuck stood in a simple fighting stance, hands up, weight balanced, his positioning so fundamental, it looked almost boring compared to Tyler's flashy movement. But anyone who knew what they were looking at could see the efficiency in it, the complete absence of wasted motion, the coiled readiness that came from someone who understood violence at a level most people never reach. The match began, and Tyler came forward immediately, throwing a combination that was fast enough to be impressive. A jab, cross, hook, low kick. Except Chuck wasn't where Tyler expected him to be. Chuck had shifted his angle so subtly that Tyler's punches hit nothing but air, and suddenly Chuck's hand was resting on Tyler's shoulder, gentle but firm, stopping his momentum completely. It happened so quickly that Tyler didn't even understand what had occurred. Chuck reset, stepped back, gave Tyler space to try again. Tyler's face showed confusion followed by irritation, and he came in harder this time, more aggressive, tried to use his youth and strength to overwhelm the older man. He threw power shots, put his weight behind them, the kind of strikes that would hurt if they landed, and none of them landed. Chuck moved like water, like his body existed in the spaces between Tyler's attacks, redirecting energy instead of blocking it, using Tyler's momentum against him. Every time Tyler thought he had an opening, Chuck was already moving out of it, and suddenly Tyler would find himself off balance, overextended, his own force working against him. It was like fighting a ghost, something that was there and not there, something that understood the shape of violence so completely that it could exist in the negative space of it. Tyler tried to clinch, tried to use his wrestling, and for just a moment he got his hands on Chuck, tried to muscle him around, and that's when he felt it, the absolute, immovable stability of someone who'd spent 60 years understanding leverage and base and how to make your body into something that couldn't be moved unless you chose to move. Chuck didn't force anything, didn't power out a clinch. He just adjusted his structure, and suddenly Tyler's grip meant nothing, and Chuck guided him to the mat with a throw that was so technically perfect it looked gentle even though it put Tyler on his back hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Tyler scrambled up, his face red now, not from exertion but from embarrassment, from the dawning realization that he was being completely outclassed and everyone was watching it happen. He came in wild, abandoning technique, just trying to land something, anything, to salvage his ego. And that's when Chuck stopped moving defensively and showed Tyler what offense looked like from someone who understood it. Chuck slipped inside Tyler's guard so smoothly it looked like a dance move, and then his hand was at Tyler's throat, not squeezing, just resting there with enough pressure to make the point clear. If this were real, if Chuck wanted to, it would be over. Then Chuck swept Tyler's leg, guided him down again, this time holding him in a lock that controlled his shoulder and elbow simultaneously, the kind of lock that could break bones if pressure was applied, but was being held with perfect control, just enough to immobilize without injuring. Chuck leaned close and said something that only Tyler could hear. His voice quiet, but carrying the weight of someone who'd lived long enough to know exactly what to say. He told Tyler that strength without wisdom was just violence, that talent without humility was just wasted potential, that respect wasn't about bowing to the past, but about understanding that everyone you meet knows something you don't, that the moment you think you've learned everything is the moment you stop growing. Chuck released him and stood up, offering his hand to help Tyler to his feet. Tyler lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, his chest heaving not from physical exhaustion, but from the emotional weight of having every assumption he'd built his identity around shattered in less than 3 minutes. He took Chuck's hand, let himself be pulled up, and for the first time since walking into the gym, he was quiet. Really quiet. Not the performative silence of someone planning their next words, but the genuine silence of someone who just had their worldview cracked open. Chuck put his hand on Tyler's shoulder, and this time it wasn't a tactical grip. It was something almost paternal, the touch of a teacher who sees potential buried under layers of ego and poor guidance. He told Tyler that he was talented, that his technique was solid, that with the right mindset, he could become something truly special. But he needed to understand that being a great fighter wasn't about being better than everyone else. It was about being better than you were yesterday, about pushing yourself not to dominate others, but to master yourself. He said the fighters Tyler needed to respect most weren't the ones he could beat, but the ones who'd paved the way for him to even have a career, who'd fought when the sport was underground and dangerous, who'd built the foundation that modern athletes stood on. The gym slowly came back to life. People returned to their training, but with periodic glances toward Tyler and Chuck, curious about what would happen next, whether Tyler would learn from this or whether his ego would rebuild itself the moment he left. Tyler stood there, his shoulders slumped, his usual swagger completely absent, looking lost in a way that suggested maybe, just maybe, something had broken through. He asked Chuck quietly if he could train here, if Chuck would teach him, not in the demanding way he'd asked before, but with genuine humility, the voice of someone who just realized how much they didn't know. Chuck studied him for a long moment, that same assessing gaze, trying to determine if this was real or if it was just wounded pride that would rebuild into the same arrogance once it healed. Then Chuck nodded, said Tyler could come back tomorrow early, before the crowds, when it was just the serious students. He said the training wouldn't be easy, that it would challenge everything Tyler thought he knew, that it would strip away performance and get down to the real substance of what made a martial artist. He said Tyler would have to check his ego at the door, put his phone away, and approach learning like a beginner even though he was already accomplished. He asked if Tyler could do that, and Tyler, to his credit, said he'd try. What happened over the next 6 months became something of a legend in the gym, whispered about in the same reverent tones people used when talking about the old days, when discipline and dedication meant something more than social media metrics. Tyler showed up every morning at 5:30. When the gym was cold and empty, and there were no cameras to record his transformation, no audience to perform for. Chuck worked him harder than he'd ever been worked, not with flashy techniques or competition training, but with fundamentals so basic they felt insulting at first. Stance work, breathing, the proper mechanics of a basic punch, broken down and rebuilt 1,000 times until Tyler could do it without thinking, until his body understood it at a level deeper than conscious thought. Chuck taught him that efficiency was more important than power, that patience was more dangerous than aggression, that understanding your opponent's intentions was worth more than raw speed. He taught Tyler to read body language, to see the micro movements that telegraph what someone was about to do, to understand range and timing at an almost supernatural level. But more than technique, Chuck taught Tyler about character. He made him help clean the gym after training, made him assist with teaching kids classes, made him sit with injured fighters and understand their stories, the sacrifices they'd made, the damage they'd accumulated in pursuit of something bigger than themselves. He made Tyler study the history of martial arts, made him watch old tournament footage, read books about the masters who'd come before, understand that he was part of a lineage that stretched back centuries, and that his responsibility was to honor that lineage, not just exploited for personal gain. Slowly, gradually, Tyler changed. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was the kind of deep structural change that happens when you rebuild someone's foundation. His social media presence shifted, less trash talk and more thoughtful content about training and discipline. His fighting style evolved, becoming more economical, more patient, more effective. But more importantly, the way he carried himself changed. The swagger was replaced with quiet confidence. The need to prove himself to everyone replaced with focus on proving himself to himself. When Tyler finally stepped back into the octagon for his next fight, the difference was obvious to anyone who understood what they were watching. He won by submission in the second round, but it wasn't the wild, aggressive performance of his earlier career. It was controlled, measured, intelligent. He weathered his opponent's strengths, found the openings, executed with precision. When the referee raised his hand, Tyler didn't showboat, didn't play to the cameras. He embraced his opponent with genuine respect, thanked the referee and judges, and in his post-fight interview, he talked not about his own greatness, but about the importance of having the right teachers, about how he'd been humbled and made better by training with legends who forgot more about martial arts than he'd ever know. He didn't name Chuck specifically, respecting the privacy of their training, but anyone who'd been paying attention knew exactly who he was talking about. Tyler's career continued to ascend, but the trajectory was different now, built on a more sustainable foundation. He became known not just for his skills, but for his sportsmanship, for the way he carried himself, for his willingness to help younger fighters avoid the mistakes he'd made. Years later, after Tyler had won a championship and defended it successfully 3 times, he was invited back to Chuck's gym for a seminar. He walked through those same doors, but this time without the camera crew, without the entourage, without the need to make an entrance. He moved through the space with reverence, remembering the person he'd been the first time he'd walked in, feeling grateful for the person he'd become. The gym was packed with young fighters, the next generation of athletes who'd grown up watching Tyler's fights, who saw him as a standard to aspire to. Chuck introduced him simply, no grand pronouncements, just said that Tyler was a champion who understood what that title really meant, who'd learned the hard way that being the best fighter in the world didn't mean anything if you weren't a good person outside the cage. Tyler taught technique for an hour, breaking down the details of his favorite submissions, but when the technical portion was done, he asked if he could share a story. He told them about the day he'd walked into this gym full of himself, convinced he had nothing left to learn, and how he'd made the mistake of disrespecting a legend because he'd been too ignorant to recognize greatness when it was standing right in front of him. He told them about how Chuck had dismantled him without hurting him, had showed him the difference between fighting and martial arts, between winning and mastery. He said the greatest gift Chuck had given him wasn't technique, though the technique had been invaluable. The greatest gift was perspective, the understanding that the martial arts journey wasn't about reaching the top of the mountain. It was about climbing with honor, about helping others climb alongside you, about recognizing that every person you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about and deserving of respect for simply being in the arena. He looked at Chuck, who was standing in the back of the room watching with that same calm expression, and he thanked him publicly, with genuine emotion, for caring enough to teach him what no one else had been willing to teach, for seeing potential in him when he'd been too insufferable to deserve it. The young fighters listened with rapt attention, and you could see them absorbing the lesson, understanding that the path to greatness wasn't paved with trash talk and viral moments, but with humility, discipline, and respect for those who'd walked the path before you. That night, after the gym had emptied and the lights were being turned off, Tyler and Chuck sat on the bench where it had all started, 2 martial artists separated by decades but connected by something deeper than age or accomplishment. Tyler asked Chuck why he'd bothered, why he'd taken the time to teach someone who'd been so disrespectful, who by all rights should have just been thrown out and forgotten. Chuck was quiet for a moment, the kind of thoughtful quiet that meant he was choosing his words carefully, and then he said that he'd seen himself in Tyler, the young version of himself who thought he knew everything, who'd had to learn the hard way that strength meant nothing without character. He said that everyone deserves a teacher, but not everyone finds one, and that he'd been fortunate enough to have masters who'd cared enough to correct him when he was wrong, to push him when he wanted to quit, to see something in him that he couldn't see in himself. He said that passing on what you've learned isn't optional. It's the fundamental responsibility of anyone who's been given the gift of knowledge, and that the martial arts have survived for thousands of years not because of the fighters who took that knowledge to their graves, but because of the teachers who gave it freely to the next generation. Tyler nodded, understanding in a way he never could have years ago, when he thought respect was weakness and humility was failure. He realized now that the strongest people he'd ever met were the ones who had nothing left to prove, who carried their accomplishments so lightly that you'd never know they were legends unless someone told you, who measured their success not by trophies or titles but by the students they'd helped become better than themselves. Chuck had taught him that real power wasn't about dominating others. It was about mastering yourself. That respect wasn't given because someone demanded it, but earned through consistent action and character. That the mark of a true martial artist wasn't in how many people they could beat, but in how they treated people who couldn't offer them anything in return. Tyler carried those lessons with him for the rest of his career, and when he eventually retired and opened his own gym, he put a photograph on the wall right by the entrance where everyone who walked in would see it. It was a picture of Chuck taken decades ago in his prime, but beneath it was a quote that Tyler had written himself, a distillation of everything he'd learned. A master is not someone who has defeated everyone else, but someone who has defeated their own ego and learned to serve something greater than themselves. The students who trained at Tyler's gym grew up hearing the story of their coach's transformation, about how he'd once been arrogant and lost until legend had cared enough to teach him what mattered. They heard about the day he'd called Chucknorris washed up and been shown exactly how wrong he was, not through humiliation, but through teaching, not through destruction, but through building. And because Tyler never let them forget that lesson, because he instilled in them the same values Chuck had instilled in him, they went out into the world as not just better fighters, but better people. They carried respect in their hearts, humility in their approach, and the understanding that every person they met deserved dignity regardless of age or appearance or whether they could offer anything in return. Tyler's legacy became not his championships or his highlight reel knockouts, but the quality of the people he'd helped shape, the culture he'd built, the respect he'd modeled. Years turned into decades, and martial arts continued to evolve. New techniques emerged, new athletes broke new records. The sport grew bigger and more popular than anyone could have imagined. But the fundamental truth remained unchanged, the truth that Chuck had taught Tyler, and that Tyler had passed on to countless others. That strength without character is just violence. That talent without humility is just wasted potential. That respect isn't about bowing to authority, but about recognizing the humanity in everyone you meet. The young fighters who'd never heard of Chucknorris because his movies were before their time, who didn't know about his tournament championships because they were focused on modern MMA, they learned his name anyway, not because it was forced on them, but because his influence echoed to the generations of fighters he taught and influenced. His legacy wasn't in trophies that would gather dust or records that would be broken, but in the minds and hearts of the people he'd shaped, in the way they carried themselves, in the values they pass on to others. Because that's the thing about true mastery, about real greatness. It doesn't announce itself, doesn't need validation, doesn't diminish others to elevate itself. It simply exists quietly and powerfully, making everyone around it better by its presence. It understands that the highest form of strength is gentleness, that the greatest power is restraint, that the most profound victories are the ones where nobody has to lose because everyone walks away having learned something that makes them better. Chucknorris could have destroyed Tyler that day in the gym, could have humiliated him, broken his spirit, sent him away defeated and diminished. Instead, he chose to teach, to build, to transform arrogance into understanding. And in doing so, he didn't just change one fighter's trajectory. He influenced everyone that fighter would go on to teach, creating ripples that spread far beyond that single moment on a worn mat in an old-school gym. The truth that Tyler learned, the truth that changed everything for him, was this: legends aren't made by how many people they defeat, but by how many people they inspire to be better. Respect isn't demanded. It's earned through consistent character and the choice to use your power to build rather than destroy. And the strongest people in any room are usually the quietest, because they have nothing left to prove to anyone but themselves. When you truly understand your craft, when you've mastered yourself before trying to master others, you stop needing the validation of the crowd. You stop measuring your worth by what you can take from others and start measuring it by what you can give. That's the difference between a fighter and a martial artist, between someone who's good at hurting people and someone who's dedicated their life to something greater than violence. Tyler learned it the hard way, through the kindness of someone who cared enough to correct him when he was wrong. And he spent the rest of his life making sure that lesson lived on, that the next generation understood what mattered, that respect and humility and character weren't old-fashioned concepts, but timeless truths that would never go out of style no matter how much the world changed around them. Real strength doesn't need to shout, because everyone who matters can already hear it.